Hi, today we're going to talk about intramolecular forces, and there are a few things I want to clarify before we move further. First is the difference between intramolecular and intermolecular. Intra means within the molecule, between two atoms. Intermolecular means between molecules. Also, I want to remind you that the nucleus is composed of neutrons and protons. Neutrons have no charge, protons are positively charged, and around this nucleus we have an electron cloud with a negative charge. Electronegativity is another important concept to review, and I want you to remember that depending on the electronegativity of an atom is how likely it is to attract electrons towards itself. And there is a periodic trend, so if you need to review the periodic trend or where to find electronegativity in a periodic table or how to differentiate metals from non-metals within the periodic table, this is a good time to stop the video and come back. So we have this table that helps us with these bonds, and so we have two bonds, that is covalent and ionic. Covalent is the sharing of electrons between two nonmetals. Ionic is the transfer of electrons between a metal and a nonmetal. But covalent further divides into two. That sharing of electrons could be even or uneven. If the sharing is even, we have an electronegativity difference between the two atoms of 0.4 or less, nonpolar covalent. If the electronegativity difference between the two nonmetals is 0.5 to 2, then we have polar covalent. And if the electronegativity difference is larger and we're talking about a metal with a non-metal, then we are talking about an ionic bond. But let's see what's happening closer in the molecule. Let's start with nonpolar covalent bonds. So in nonpolar covalent bonds, we're talking about sharing of electrons between two nonmetals, and this sharing is even. If we were to look at the electronegativity, since in this case we have the same atom, it's just 2.1 minus 2.1 for hydrogen, which is 0. You may have a different number here, not 0, if you have a non-diatomic molecule, but as long as it's less than 0.4, it's two nonmetals, you're still talking about nonpolar covalent. And what's happening is that because the nucleus are attracting the electrons around them, with about the same force. And so there is no reason in this case, for example, why electrons would rather hang around this hydrogen more than this other one. And so this is why the electron cloud is evenly distributed. The nucleus are pulling the protons towards the center with the same force. Again, this is the sharing of electrons. Now let's talk about more sharing of electrons, but this is not evenly distributed, and this is polar covalent bonds. In this case, we have an HCl molecule. Cl has an electronegativity of about 3 and hydrogen of 2.1. The difference being 0.9 is within our range of polar covalent. They are both nonmetals. But then when we look at this figure, we can see it even more clearly that chlorine is attracting more electrons towards itself. So the electrons hang out around this chlorine much more of the time, giving this side of the molecule a partial negative charge and giving this side of the molecule a partial positive side. Because we have these positive negative poles is what we're talking about a polar covalent molecule. There's no transfer of electrons, it's just uneven sharing. And last but not least, let's talk about ionic. And ionic happens between a metal and a non-metal, lithium and fluorine in this case. Fluorine has an electronegativity of 4 and then lithium of 1. When we find the difference, it's pretty large. What happens because this electronegativity is so large, basically the fluorine is going to take an electron from the lithium. When it does that, this lithium loses an electron, becomes positive, and that's what we call a cation. This one takes an extra electron, becomes negative, and it's what we call an anion. And the interaction between this positive and negative side, or negative ion and positive ion, is what allows the ionic molecules to actually exist and these atoms to interact. So a little recap before we go. Polar covalent means the sharing unevenly of electrons. Nonpolar covalent is the even sharing of electrons. And ionic is the transfer of an electron to make ions that will interact. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you very much for listening, and next time we'll talk about intermolecular forces.